my name is Jennifer Kitchen, and today I'll be talking about college and university educational interpreting. And since I'm doing this on a video, I also attached the actual PowerPoint if you want to view that and be able to look at that a little easier too and look at what I wrote and stuff. So, first of all, kind of a little bit about educational interpreting at the college and university level. So what I picked to kind of analyze today is post-secondary education. So for example, that might look like interpreting for an individual student, which means you would go to their classes and interpret for all of their different classes that they have throughout the day. And one cool opportunity with this is that you'd be able to build a relationship with the student. Doing educational interpreting sounds very interesting to me because I think it's important to assist deaf students in learning, and I would choose post-secondary education since the students are more interested in learning and they've chosen to go on to college or university and are serious about their learning. So some scholarly research that I looked at was an article called Access to Post-Secondary Education Through Sign Language Interpreting. And the article is by Mark Marshak, Patricia Sapir, Carol Convertino, and Rosemary Seawagen. It was published in 2005, and it was published in the Journal of Deaf Studies and Deaf Education. And here is a picture of what the journal actually looks like on the outside. So in order to kind of give you guys a picture of what the journal talks about and stuff like that, I have my article annotation here. So in the article, Access to Post-Secondary Education Through Sign Language Interpreting, 4 professional researchers explore deaf students' access to post-secondary education in integrated classrooms with hearing students and an interpreter present. The research was conducted by using previous studies and their own study that involved 23 interpreters, 105 deaf students, and 22 hearing students, which showed that sign language interpreting did not provide deaf students with equal access to the class content as their hearing peers. The 4 researchers evaluated numerous points of data and analyzed their resources before writing this credible article that was published in the Journal of Deaf Studies and Deaf Education. This article informed me about the issues in an integrated classroom for deaf students with the author's persuasive but slightly complex data. I did not realize that there is currently no way to provide full access in integrated classrooms, integrated post-secondary classrooms for deaf students, even with the use of interpreters. So one association that helps out educational interpreters is the National Association of Interpreters for Education in Education, or NAIE. And here's their logo down at the bottom for NAIE. And their mission statement is the National Association of Interpreters in Education, or NAIE, empowers educational interpreters to promote best practices and to enhance the education of deaf, hard of hearing, and deafblind students. Some of NAIE's goals are to promote and provide continuous skills development opportunities. That way interpreters can increase the quality of interpreting to benefit students and give students the best access to education as they can. And then another one of their goals is to educate the public about the importance of educational interpreting. As a member of NAIE, members can participate in a variety of professional development activities, which is strongly promoted by this organization, such as watching webinars, going to conferences, and there's also several online resources. Here at the bottom is NAIE's website if you wanted to explore that more. So for educational interpreting, there are specific certifications and accreditations that are required. These are the requirements for Oregon Public School employees. So before an educational interpreter can be employed by an Oregon Public School district, they must receive a passing score of 3.5 or above on the Educational Interpreter Performance Assessment, or EIPA, performance test, or have a couple of different RID certification options. So they could either have the National Interpreter Certification, the NIC, the Certification of Interpretation, CI, or the Certification of Transliteration, CT. So those are a couple different options for either passing the score, have a passing score, or have a different kind of certification. They also must earn a bachelor's or associate's degree from an interpreter education program or in a related field. And then they also must complete 12 hours of continuing professional development related to sign language education per year. This could be going to conferences or doing the webinars, just getting that continued professional development. Here are some certifications. So this is a Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, so the RID, one of the types of certifications, and then here's another one for the Certificate of Transliteration. So there's just a couple options that show you guys what the certifications look like. So another thing that's really important in the interpreter world is something called Entry to Practice Competencies. And these give interpreters different competencies that are very important to be an interpreter. I looked at a couple different of the domains and picked out specific things from those domains that were very important to educational interpreting. So domain 3, which is language skills competency, and what I picked out was 3.3, which says demonstrate advanced and effective public speaking skills in both ASL and English through the spontaneous delivery of an informal and a prepared formal presentation. So educational interpreters should be able to communicate effectively with students so that they're receiving the content of their lectures. For me, I should improve in this area in school through practicing ASL and public speaking skills and practicing those together. After I graduate, I will continue my education in this area through professional development activities. Another domain to look at is domain 4, which is interpreting skills competencies. 4.5 says demonstrate flexibility to transliterate or interpret it by observing the language use of deaf or hard of hearing consumers and or make adjustments based on consumer feedback. So it's important for an interpreter to match the learning needs of the students. Some students prefer interpretation, some students prefer transliteration, so it's important that that need is met so students are getting access to the classroom content as best as possible. And like I said, each student receives information a little differently, so it's important that their needs are accommodated. And in order to improve this while I'm in school, I should learn the differences between transliteration and interpreting and how to do each of those effectively so that I'm prepared when I'm out in the workforce. And once I've graduated, I can improve in this area through continued practice on the job. So another entry to practice competency that I thought was important to educational interpreting was domain 5, which is professional competencies. And I picked two out, 5.1 and 5.2. 5.1 says demonstrate a commitment to career-long learning, and 5.2 says demonstrate planning skills in preparing for assignments. I felt both of these were very important because interpreters should commit to learning throughout their careers in order to improve their interpreting, and continued education will help interpreters perform better and prepare for assignments. And it's also really important to plan and prepare for assignments in educational interpreting, such as getting material ahead of time so that you're very prepared. I look forward to continuing learning about educational interpreting while I'm here at school at WU, and also continuing my learning through professional development activities after I graduate. So there's a lot of things that have happened in the ASL interpreting world, which has honestly happened really in the last 100 years between kind of the 1950s and now, which is crazy that interpreting is still such a new field. But some things that I'd like to point out kind of in the ASL English interpreting timeline that are mostly related to interpreting, but also a couple that relate to educational interpreting specifically. So first of all, in 1964, the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf was founded, or known as RID. Also in 1964 was the first workshop for interpreting for the deaf, so that got professional interpreting started. In 1972 was the first certification exams by RID, so this allowed interpreters to be certified and really be professionals. In 1990 was the ADA, or the Americans with Disabilities Act. After this act was passed, there was an increased need for interpreters, since now deaf people were recognized as having the need to have an interpreter. A little more recently, in 2005, the RID Code of Professional Conduct was introduced, which, like we talked about before, gave interpreters a professional code to follow and set standards, which I'll talk more about later as well. In 2008, in Oregon was when there was an implementation of minimum standards for sign language interpreters serving students in Oregon public schools. So for interpreters in public schools, they now had a minimum standard, and then again in 2013 they revised those minimum standards. So when we're looking at the educational interpreting context, it's important to analyze several different factors. So like I mentioned, today we'll be looking at college and university or tertiary education. So this would be happening in a classroom setting. And one thing I would like to point out is that a lot of interpreters will be working with a student throughout the whole term or semester, and so it will be a lot easier for interpreters to interpret for a class if they've interpreted from the beginning of class and follow through to the end. Some things about doing university interpreting is that there can be a pretty complex vocabulary, since they might be really specialized things, or maybe something that you've never learned in school about, like science or mathematics. So that could be really complex and having difficult vocabulary and jargon to deal with. But one nice thing is that the students are going to be more professional because they've decided to pursue a higher education. And oftentimes, compared to primary or secondary education, in tertiary education it's going to be more of a lecture form, which means there'll be more of a formal register. There won't be as much back and forth happening in the classroom. So a little bit more about the context. At the college and university level, there will be a very diverse population of students, since they'll be coming from all over and having maybe moved to come to this school. So that will be a part of being an educational interpreter. Like I mentioned before, the students, your clients, are very excited and wanting to learn, hopefully, since they've chosen to do secondary education. Now, again, there will be some linguistic and cultural issues with this. So kind of like I mentioned before, interpreters may be unfamiliar with the jargon or vocabulary of these classes. Another thing to consider is that sometimes teachers or other students will have a lack of understanding of deaf students and interpreters and how they work. So that might be something that you'll have to come across and be a bridge between your deaf client and the other hearing people and explain what that will look like. So, like I mentioned, there's now the RID Code of Professional Conduct, and I chose a couple of those to show how they relate to educational interpreting. So one of them, 2.0, is professionalism, and 2.1 states provide service delivery regardless of race, color, national origin, gender, religion, age, disability, sexual orientation, or any other factor. And this is very important because, like I talked about before, some universities are very diverse, so it's important that when you're accepting an educational interpreting job, that you're ready to work with all kinds of people and not discriminate because of that. Next one is 3 is conduct, and 3.1 says consult with appropriate persons regarding the interpreting situation to determine issues such as placement and adaptation necessary to interpret effectively. It's really important as an educational interpreter to talk to the professor and make sure you'll have a good location in the classroom, that will have a good sight line with your client so that they can be seeing your interpretation, and that you're in a good place in the classroom to hear the professor speaking and what they're saying. Another one is 4, respect for consumer, and 4.1 says consider consumer requests or needs regarding the language preferences and render the message accordingly, like interpreted or transliterated. And in the article that I mentioned before, Marshak et al., they talked a lot about the differences between transliteration and interpretation and how that may be important to different students. So that's always important to determine before your assignment so you know which is better for the student. And the last one I included was 7, which is professional development, and 7.1 says increase knowledge and strengthen skills through professional development activities. Like we talked about before, it's really important to continue your professional development throughout your career. So another important thing interpreting is to analyze and look at the demand and control schemas in an interpreting situation. So there's 4 different types of demands. There's environmental, interpersonal, paralinguistic, and interpersonal. So for you guys, I've set up some demand examples and some control options of ways that an interpreter could respond to these demands in order to control the situation to the best of their ability. So under environmental, we have goal or purpose of the class, and an interpreter can ask the professor for material ahead of time so they can prepare and know what the subject of the class will be. Another one is terminology or jargon of the class. An interpreter can prepare for this beforehand by reviewing vocabulary, and if there's some new vocabulary that you or the client does not know, you guys can negotiate a new vocabulary for whatever this word is. Another part of the environment is the physical surroundings. It's important, like I mentioned before, that the interpreter works with the professor to have a good sight line of the student and an appropriate space to work. Part of interpersonal, one is communication style. Like I mentioned before, check with the student on their preferred signing style as in transliteration or interpretation. Another part is relationships. If you are interpreting for a student every day, you're definitely going to build a relationship with the student, but it's also important to remember to remain impartial. Part of paralinguistic would be clarity of speech. So maybe if you're having a hard time understanding the professor, you might remind them to speak clearly so that you can interpret the message to the best of your ability. Another part is physical position, which, like I kind of mentioned before, it's important to maintain a good seating position and a clear viewing of the client. And another thing is idiosyncrasies of the speaker. So try to show the characteristic of the speaker, although this may depend on the register that the speaker is in. And last, we have interpersonal. So you may have concerns about this situation, but it's important to try to only accept jobs that are within your comfort level and ability. And last behavior is physical and psychological distractions. It's really important for interpreters to take care of themselves, both emotionally and physically, so that they're always ready for their job and that is not distracting them. So if I was to be doing this in a classroom setting where I was actually talking to other interpreting students, I would want to ask what kind of interpreting do the other students want to do, just to find out, because we got to explore university and college or post-secondary educational interpreting today in my presentation, but I would love to see what other students want to explore. And then here's just my reference list of all the things I referenced today. So thank you so much for listening to me talk about post-secondary education in the interpreting field.